Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Perspective. We saw the Prime Minister's address of the United Nations General Assembly, and he spoke at length about the atrocities Israel is committing. He talked about the way that the Palestinian people are consistently being terrorized in a systematic manner. He also spoke about Kashmir and how we Muslims are suffering continuously in Kashmir. The Prime Minister spoke at length about terrorism and how Pakistan has battled against it, how much we've lost as a nation, how much we've lost as a country to the fight against terrorism. Of course, climate change also, and the challenges that poses for Pakistan. We saw $30 billion worth of damage just last year. Of course, and expected the summers, the weather extremes that are expected to increase every year. We'll be talking about what the Prime Minister said, the ramifications of his detailed address on the issues that confront Pakistan and their global implication all over. Let's hear what the Prime Minister had to say on Israel and its atrocities on Kashmir that are continuing seamlessly.
Today I stand before you to express the searing pain and anguish of the people of Pakistan at the plight of the people of Gaza. Our heart bleeds as we witness the tragedy unfolding in the Holy Land, a tragedy that shakes the very conscience of humanity and the foundation of this institution. Mr. President, can we as human beings remain silent while children lie buried under the rubble of their shattered homes? Can we turn a blind eye to mothers cradling the lifeless bodies of the children? This is not just a conflict, this is systematic slaughter of innocent people of Palestine. When we ignore their endless suffering, we diminish our humanity. It is not enough to condemn, Mr. President. We must act now and demand an immediate end to this bloodshed.
I have with me today Dr. Waqas Ali Kausar, who is an IR expert. Thank you for joining us today. We also have with us Dr. Adnan Sarwar, who is a foreign affairs expert. Thank you for joining us today. And Dr. Jamil Ahmed, who is a former ambassador. Thank you everyone for being with us today. Dr. Waqas, you heard what the Prime Minister said today. Of course, there's no, the way that the world continues to watch what happens in Israel, the way, and the Prime Minister talked about how mothers, cradle the bodies of their lifeless children. There are no words really in terms of the address and its overall effect. We saw, of course, Netanyahu also and the Pakistani delegation walked out when he was going to speak. Overall, what do you see and in the way that the world has continued to watch Israel and the Prime Minister's address?
Thank you very much, first of all, for having me on your show. His address, and if you see the overall context, he has touched upon different aspects very important for his for nationally and internationally as well, particularly when it comes to the conflicts. I guess this signifies that the institutions like United Nations and Security Council and other Human Rights Council as well for that matter, they all are sort of failing their core area and demand of what people or institutions or the countries look towards them for preserving peace and security. So that's a big challenge to them as well. One, if you see what Prime Minister has said about Palestine and Kashmir also, and then of course on the larger issues, I guess there's a broader question that the idea of this multilateralism, when you think of collective and common good, and having a shared goal. I guess there's a bigger question that what is the idea of common good? How the world is now increasingly, I guess, getting polarized in the conflict and the issue like of Palestine, what happened over there. Despite resolutions, despite condemnations, I guess nothing seriously have been done and no progress have been made. And if you see the conflicts, particularly over there, the intensity of violence is rising. And if you see the Prime Minister of Israel's speech, there was nothing substantial to offer and it was just a one-sided story depicting themselves as innocent or maybe the victim. But on the other side, if you see the atrocities, the level of violence committed by them, it's unprecedented in history, number one. Number two, I guess there's a greater need, not only our Prime Minister's speech. If you see across the board, particularly if you see the divide between global South and North, there is very apparently very open and very wide gap, I must say, coming out. And from the speeches of the people, that when you see that in international institutions are continuously failing the demands of the people, that's a bigger problem, I guess. Now you have to restore your credibility, of course. Prime Minister, while saying about a particular issue of Jammu and Kashmir, if you see the right to self-determination, if talk
we'll
about
come and talk about Kashmir in detail also. Let me go to Dr. Jamil Ahmed Khan. Dr. Jamil, if you heard what Dr. Waqas is saying, I think, there are no two opinions about how the world, and we've spoken about this, the way the world continues to watch the atrocities being committed. And I think the Prime Minister was spot on when he said that this is systematic and there's no, other word for the way that it is happening and the way that it is, being ignored by the world. But that said, do you think that, it can be camouflaged and the divide that Dr. Waqas is talking about between, the global South and the global North? What is your view on that?
That's right. The world obviously now is a polarized world, and but the majority of the countries of the world, they are on the side of the victim, and that has been demonstrated on the streets of the Europe and North America and so many other parts of the world. So that is a clear demonstration that yes, the world is quite conscious, but the rulers and the United States and its allies, that is where the polarization one can see, that their public opinion is different and their government actions are different. So we'll come in on that for a while, but the Prime Minister's speech has encompassed most of these international burning points and burning topics, such as Palestine, Ukraine, Kashmir, and what does it imply? Why it has been once again covered? These points have been covered by Human Rights Council at two different occasions through their reports. It has been covered by the media of the world. It has also been covered by the United Nations and the General Assembly. But now encompassing all those points within that time frame of 20 minutes, that was quite cogently, the points were quite cogently put across, starting from the foreign policy. In fact, all the head of the states and the head of the government who appear at the moment in General Assembly, there are 75 head of the government and head of the states. They are present, and rest of the countries are represented by their foreign ministers mostly. So the entire world, this is the highest forum where we have the topmost leadership of the world. So at that platform where they are watching physically, they can see what is happening around and who is saying what. And then, of course, the billions of people watching the proceedings of the General Assembly, it does have its impact. But we should also be mindful that the General Assembly has its limited scope. General Assembly, first of all, there is no resolution passed during these speeches of these in September, particularly that is from 23rd to 27th. So there won't be any resolution. But basically, highlighting these points means that this is the clear indication of your foreign policy of the respective countries, and B, the topmost burning points of the world. C, that it correlates with the United Nations Charter, and D, that the United Nations Security Council resolutions, which has earlier been passed and has not been implemented. Prime Minister has been able to cover all that. In addition, Prime Minister has been able to cover the other existential problem of the entire world, and that's climate change. And climate change, terrorism.
Yes, we'll talk about, I want to move on and talk about that, but let me go to Dr. Adnan Sarwar. Dr. Adnan, we're talking about the Prime Minister's address and of course this particular focus on the atrocities committed by Israel. like Ambassador Saab said, of course, you know, the effectiveness, the limited effectiveness of the UN, and you know, the fact that resolutions we've also seen in the past have been flouted quite you know, clearly, starkly, I would say. Do you think that, you know, but at the same time, when we look at the address and when we look at the way that the people have come out for the cause overall, it also exposes clearly that the world knows where the right and wrong of this is?
Yes, well, you are true. Actually, first of all, I would like to say that it was one of the best speeches heard and seen by me over the years by any leader of Pakistan at that highest forum of the world. Furthermore, you see, the point that you are trying to ask is that, and to that question, I'll try to respond in the way that the problem, as you see, the Secretary General also has highlighted a couple of days ago, is that the system of the United Nations at the Security Council is such that if even one veto power doesn't allow a passage of a resolution or the application of sanction if some country doesn't stop its aggression, as in this case Israel, so that doesn't get implemented. So my considered view is, and that you see, the United Nations itself is working since the end of the Cold War, particularly since year 2000, the reforms in the United Nations. And one very big reform is needed in the United Nations Security Council. And I believe that in this, what we call as democratic era, particularly in the post-Cold War era and period, we say it is becoming more and more democratic. This dictatorial club of the five, in which just 2 or 3 countries are very responsible, standing for peace, like People's Republic of China, etc. But you see, the other countries, they have their foot on those very peaceful resolutions which call for peace. So I think that over the next few years, it has become deadly urgent that United Nations Security Council is reformed and veto power has somehow to be removed. While this would be a very difficult job to get it back from some very important powers, but then you see this, if continues, then the same carnage that you are seeing in on Gaza people, children including women, including young and old, would always continue. And the kind of impunity with Israel, with which Israel is carrying out all disregarding, totally disrespecting, and not carrying the UN Security Council resolutions and General Assembly resolutions, has become a slap on the face of the UN. So I would say that it is a time that the UN reforms, particularly in the United States Security Council, maybe the permanent members are there, but they are not with the veto powers. Maybe their number is increased to 10 to represent different countries which still are not there. And the non-permanent also are increased. And something like 2/3 majority, more than 75% of majorities of votes may be considered as the passage of a resolution. So this is my initial response to this very sensitive question.
Fair enough. Let me come back to you, Dr. Adnan. I also want to talk about, when we talk about atrocities and when we talk about the way that we've seen suffering in the world, we can't ignore Kashmir. And of course, the Prime Minister spoke about that in some detail, and the way that, you know, the Muslims in Kashmir continue to be oppressed by India, and of course terrorism that has poured from across the border also. Will come to that. But let's hear what the Prime Minister had to say on Kashmir.
Similarly, like the people of Palestine, the people of Jammu and Kashmir too have struggled for a century for their freedom and right to self-determination. Instead of moving towards peace, India has resiled from its commitments to implement the Security Council resolutions on Jammu and Kashmir. These resolutions mandate a plebiscite to enable the people of Jammu and Kashmir to exercise their fundamental right to self-determination. Since the 5th of August 2019, India has initiated unilateral illegal steps to impose what its leaders ominously call a final solution for Jammu and Kashmir. Day in and day out, 900,000 Indian troops terrorized the people of occupied Jammu and Kashmir with draconian measures including prolonged curfews, extrajudicial killings, and the abduction of thousands of young Kashmiris. At the same time, in a classic settler colonial project, India is seizing Kashmiri lands and properties and settling outsiders into occupied Jammu and Kashmir in their nefarious design to transform the Muslim majority into a minority.
You heard what the Prime Minister said. You know, the way that, of course, we can't ignore the suffering of our Kashmiri brethren. We've seen the way that the world continues to ignore it. Again, you know, if you go to what Dr. Adnan was saying, and I think Dr. Jamil, you know, the unilateral, in a democratic world, I think to quote him, he talked about the unilateral nature of the UN with the veto power. Do you think that, you know, we can perhaps, when we look at these two cases, for example, Palestine, Kashmir and other conflicts we've seen before that, do you think there's a chance to revisit this? There will be a move towards it?
See, on Kashmir particularly, when he spoke about Kashmir, what happened particularly post 5th of August 2019, I guess there is a significance of it talking at General Assembly because of the nature of the conflict, because the United Nations Security Council has passed not one many resolutions, particularly when it comes to right to self-determination of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. This also raises the question what you are also mentioning about the capacity or the conflict management capacity of the international institutions, and particularly these the bodies like UN and UNSC. Also, when you have the human rights violation, when you don't have the self-determination, the problem lies is that the outcome is more conflict, more intense conflict, more complex conflict, particularly in the case of Kashmir. When you see there a lot of human rights violation happened in past, the civil liberties, and when it comes to the now a new sort of idea of, you know, sort of converting majority into minority. So the entire BJP's project on Kashmir particularly, when you see, so this also not only complicates but make the entire issue very difficult and complex to engage. Then of course when you talk about this entire multilateralism and these institutions based on cooperation and justice particularly, this limits the capacity of the states to engage, particularly one, and of course this further exacerbates the conflict, particularly when, and you know, it seizes the opportunities to collaborate. Like climate change is, you know, many of the leaders and our Prime Minister very eloquently and very openly mentioned what has happened with Pakistan due to this climate change thing, despite that we are not contributing to this carbon emission. But you know, the prospects of cooperation at South Asian level are very mild because of this intense conflict between these two neighbors. So generally when your capacity to resolve conflicts, particularly larger, you are incapacitated to do that. Your institutions, I must say, lack that capacity to resolve the conflicts. The chances of cooperation and all these things become very weak, and then this further intensify the conflict. And of course the issues, if you see broader issues like almost all of the leaders are mentioning, like poverty, this terrorism, human rights violations, and the groups, what happened in many countries that mercenaries and other groups are doing. These all are actually the outcome of a certain, I must say, failures or the weaknesses of the international system. Now it comes to the idea of how to make it more effective. I guess there's a serious need of debate that how they have the peace building commissions, how the nations particularly, if they want to sustain this system, how they want to invest in this infrastructure, particularly soft infrastructure, where they can build the capacity of the communities, and they, for the collective good, need to understand that this entirely, this gap between these two poles, I must say, the ever increasing gap, I guess this won't serve for their collective good, particularly when it comes to the broader issues, I mean Palestine and Kashmir. if you see that, there are many connected things to that. I mean, the challenges are every day increasing. If these nations are unable to resolve these conflicts and challenges, the things get more complex. Let's suppose you have in coming times, you have the challenge of artificial intelligence, this data, and how the countries particularly are using for security purposes and all that. So I guess this can lead to a broader and bigger conflict. And Prime Minister also mentioned in one of the in his statements that if you see that they will respond to any sort of aggression against the land. So I guess this increases the chances of the more intense conflicts. So of course there's a lot of need to think on that.
And that also, I think I'm going to go to Ambassador Saab with this. Ambassador Saab, increased conflict, the danger of increased conflict, between nations, two nuclear nations, particularly when we talk about Pakistan and India, and of course terrorism that is linked to that later, that comes from across the border. We know that, we'll come to that, but do you think there's also a need for a renewed push with regard to the UN and with regard to these conflicts and the UN's role and the fact that it's becoming, there's a lot of criticism on whether it's becoming a glorified debating club without effectiveness, and we've seen in the recent past that being underscored?
That's right. In fact, Chapter 5 of the United Nations Charter is very clear about the General Assembly. And General Assembly has a specific role and very clearly dilated upon. General Assembly resolutions can be passed. They have 6 committees through which the General Assembly proceedings, they take place. And after this meeting, summit of the head of state and head of government, it is followed until December by various committees, and those committees are for the budget, for economy, for security, for so many other things. So any resolution subsequently passed. By the way, this debate, what takes place among all the head of the states and head of the government, it does not have any, they do not pass any resolution for it. It's basically for the awareness. It's basically the public diplomacy. And it's basically the foreign policy which various head of states and head of government, they try and dilate upon in front of the world, because it's the highest forum where the maximum number of the world leaders are there, the top world leaders are there. So other than that, General Assembly was not, it's not meant for. Basically, even if the resolutions are passed, it's a non-binding. We have seen that the Palestinian resolution passed. We have seen regarding their membership, 143 countries have unanimously passed that. And then, even then, it could not happen because the Security Council does not. So there are 2 components of United Nations, major components. There are more components, but one is the General Assembly, the other one is a Security Council. Now, Security Council is basically the one which have the power to implement any decision which they take. Now, the irony of the fate is, and this is what Prime Minister has mentioned with different words and different style about the Kashmir, that the United Nations Security Council resolutions have not been implemented. Kashmir, like was in Palestine. For example, Prime Minister mentioned about 1967 boundaries, which Israel, was supposed to, under the Security Council resolution 242, they were supposed to really go back to their original positions, and they had to really leave the territory which they had occupied, but they did not do that. And there are more than about 11 or 12 Security Council resolutions they have not really adhered to. So what does it imply? These resolutions were passed under Chapter 5, unless it is the resolutions are passed to be implemented under Chapter 6 of the United Nations. And finally, if that doesn't work, Chapter 7. But who is going to do that? As I said, that Security Council, because of the veto power among the some of the member countries, 5 member countries, they have the final say. In case if one of the countries don't like the resolution, it's vetoed, like it happened while the peace resolution was proposed by Algeria and others for the Palestine to stop the atrocities or to stop the aggression there. But then that was vetoed by the United States. And there were other resolutions also that was vetoed. So the solution which was being discussed earlier is that there is a platform now in the world, and there is a fast realization among the member countries. And there were more than 60 countries, they are working on united for consensus. That is what they have given the title to it. And United for Consensus, these countries are now advocating and trying their best to enhance the scope and enhance the membership. For example, AU would have a permanent seat and the veto power, and likewise, Germany wants one, Italy wants one, and likewise, other countries. In fact, India is also competing for it. So basically, if that is expanded, that would try and bring some balance, and this veto matter they are going to address. If at all that is agreed by, it's going to take a lot of time. Coming back on the point that Prime Minister has mentioned about the slaughtering of the people in Gaza, and then consistent slaughtering of the people, genocide. He has used the word genocide, which is being used by other entities of the world also, including ICC, International Criminal Court, as well as the Human Rights Commission. But Prime Minister has once again repeated that, and he has very vehemently said that the world has to join their hands and heads together and bring the conflict to the end. And while he was discussing, he mentioned about Lebanon also. Likewise, about Kashmir, he took the name of Burhanuddin Wani, and he took the name that the footsteps of Burhanuddin Wani is being followed by the people of Kashmir for their freedom. And then they are allowed, basically, all what he said, the Prime Minister, if we decipher it, and if we link it with the international law, you'll find most of it has been discussed under the framework of the international law, which is United Nations Charter, of which he, at the very opening of his speech, mentioned about Qaeda Muhammad Ali Jinnah and his policy that the United Nations Charter and they should be respected, and we support United Nations Charter in totality. Also, we like to have peace with all the countries of the world. He started his speech from there, and then he came on the genocide and the plight of the children and women and the holy places. He clearly dilated upon the holy places, where the
when we talk about awareness, let me go to Dr. Adnan. I'll come back to you, Dr. Adnan. When we talk about awareness, we spoke about with the issue of Palestine, Kashmir, and the way that people, wherever the power lies, the question is that, and I think Ambassador Saab talked about this at some length, but do you agree that there has to be a time for the world when that balance has to be redressed and the oppressors have to be called to question? We've seen South Africa, we've seen the way that they have, come out against what's happening in Palestine. They've been through apartheid, all of that. Do you think that move towards that after these speeches also, the way that whether they have a formal status or not, the question is that they will resonate with the world, right?
Yes, so you're absolutely right. In fact, you see, the Prime Minister has tried to awaken the conscience of the leaders of the world and the big countries, particularly, who calls the shot in such matters, as well as the people of the world, to be responding very quickly. He said, just not the condemnation, but acting to stop the war immediately. And there could be no stronger words that he used today. He didn't mince the words. His stand was categorical, and has mentioned that Al-Quds Sharif be the capital of the future Palestinian state, and he talked about Kashmir. But the point is that this is, I think, the prime time in the world today that the United Nations and, of course, the members and their top leaders of the countries in the Security Council, etc., they wake up to the call of the people. In many places, you see, just a couple of days ago, it was a demonstration again against the killings in Lebanon and overall in Gaza. So when they will try to come out of their deep slumber in insensitiveness, I would say criminal insensitiveness, and by doing this, I believe that Israel is going to be just, in fact, condemned by even those people in the West in fact also, who were somehow sympathetic to its existence in that place. So I think that if Israel even now also doesn't listen to the call of the states of the world and General Assembly and the people of the world particularly, their own people, the Jews for peace are clamoring for that. What to speak of the rest of the others like the Muslims. So this, I think, is going to be such a massive criminality that would lead to further carnage by some warmongers. Now this, therefore, I think has been done wonderfully well and very forceful, though it was an emotional speech also, was very well balanced and calculated. And almost all issues, in addition to this climate change and Pakistan's economic modernization and Ukraine war and terrorism from Afghanistan and multilateralism, look East, look Africa policy, and you see climate change. And so he looked straight in the eyes of all those problems. And I think now that the leaders of the world in the GA, United Nations,
we talk about, of course, well articulated, balanced, of course, and moving on, he also talked about terrorism at some length in the way that we as a nation, Pakistan has suffered at the hands of terrorism. We've lost lives, we've lost the lives of our children, of our women, and we continue to do so to terrorism, and the way that we've responded, of course, the way that we've stood resolutely against terrorism in Pakistan. Let's hear what the Prime Minister said, and we'll talk about what his comments and his talk in the UN really signifies.
For 2 decades, Pakistan has fought terrorism boldly and most successfully, defeating terrorist groups within Pakistan. We have paid a very heavy price. 80,000 of our brave soldiers and civilians have been martyred, including innocent school-going children. And the gory memories of APS school carnage haunt us till date. Our economy has suffered a loss of $150 billion. Unfortunately, today, we are again confronted by a new wave of externally financed and sponsored terrorism, especially by the TTP, Fitna al-Khawarij, and its associates. Ladies and gentlemen, make no mistake, inshallah, by the grace of God, we are determined to eliminate this threat as well through our comprehensive national effort by the name of Azm-e-Istehkam.
We saw what the Prime Minister said. Dr. Waqas, of course, you know, we've suffered and for decades, like the Prime Minister said. Do you think the world really acknowledges the way that Pakistan, the role that we've played in this fight against terrorism? It's a potentially volatile region. For Pakistan to stand against terrorism in this way is no small feat.
Yes, I guess, I mean, Pakistan has, the way it suffered due to this menace of terrorism, I guess no other country has ever faced such a prolonged period of terrorism. And then if you see across the society, or almost all the facets of life have been impacted by this, may it be schools, industry and other. Of course, it has many outcomes and impacts on our lives. I guess there is a need to tell the story of Pakistan to the world as well, that how it has deeply impacted, and the way the people have laid their sacrifices in their lives for the protection of the not only citizen state, but of course for the international order and system as well. This is very important, that how we sort of articulate our argument internationally, that how this menace requires collective action and collective resolve from international world, and to understand that this is not only Pakistan's problem, this is a global problem.
It's a global problem.
And,
that's what
and just quickly one thing, when we talk about all these things, just one thing, I guess this also requires one thing, that when the international institutions like UNSC and others generally don't pay attention, and the countries won't go for collaborative engagements and arrangements, countries would resort to, like they went to ICJ against Israel. I guess there's a greater need to understand that, may it be terrorism, may it be other. the fundamental role, of course, after the governments, there's a very foremost fundamental role is of civil society and the people, and they are not enabled. That's the fundamental problem right now. We see that people coming to the streets, talking a lot, protesting, but it's not materialized in that way.
Yes.
I guess this also needs to be understood. Maybe terrorism, maybe other the international frameworks should enable those spaces and invest more on these civil societies and groups, because those are the people, those who are resisting against the very menace of terrorism, maybe state aggression and other things. So this is important.
I think it's a very relevant point, and I think I'll go to Dr. Jamil. Dr. Jamil, I think Dr. Waqas raises a very important point when we talk about terrorism, when we talk about the way that it has been used against countries like Pakistan, of course, and this has global consequences, whether we talk about Israel, whether we talk about the oppression in Kashmir, whether we talk about terrorism, whether even we talk about climate change, the issues that the Prime Minister mentioned. The question is that the power of the people and the way that they've come out on these issues, the way around the world, the fact that it fails to translate to anything, and that is the system overall. The kind of system, the kind of world that we inhabit leaves that out. The power structure is such, and I think that's an extremely important question for the future, no? And I think the Prime Minister also underscores that, his speech overall on these issues.
That's right, and then one thing, if I could underscore what Prime Minister also mentioned, that is the geopolitical landscape and the regional geopolitical situation. So if we keep that into consideration, and once we talk about that, so civil society and the voices of the people and the demonstration which we see all over the world, particularly in regard to Palestine, they give us a different picture altogether, and the support of the people around the world, and they are in favor of the humanity, and they are against the aggressor. But their respective government, because of the geopolitical considerations, because of the alignment, because they are allies of a very strong country, which is US, who happens to be all out to help Israel. By the way, there are more than about 20,000 tons of the bombs and explosives have been supplied on one side, and on the other side, the three-phase peace plan is also being advocated. And that has very clearly been mentioned by Mr. Mahmoud Abbas, who is heading the PLA. And the other, the Turkish president also mentioned about it. So these are different, these are the different faces of the world rulers. So because of which it is not happening. And as I mentioned earlier, that the United Nations can only be forceful if the Security Council becomes a little more empowered. And I mentioned about the United Consensus, about more than 60 countries, they are making their efforts. Let's hope that it materializes. The Prime Minister, the other factor which he mentioned, and he correlated it with the losses which we have suffered, that is the terrorism. And one thing which I would again like to highlight here is he mentioned that how the external forces are supporting these elements. And this has also been mentioned in the monitoring team report, which is subsidiary, or which is the component, one of the components of the Security Council. It reports directly to the Security Council. They have very clearly mentioned what Prime Minister has indicated in his speech about the terrorists and its groups in Afghanistan. That correlates with the Doha agreement, and after that there are about 4 or 5 Security Council resolutions in which Afghanistan has been emphasized that they should not let the soil of Afghanistan be used for these terrorist groups. There are 20 terrorist groups at the moment.
Right, fair enough. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Waqas Ali Kausar. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Jamil Ahmed Khan, thank you for being with us. Dr. Adnan Sarwar, thank you for joining us. Of course, the Prime Minister was extremely articulate. He in a speech that was very well balanced. He drew the attention of the world to those causes that are very close to our heart, and also the way that we suffer as a result of the pain that is caused to the Kashmiri brethren, the loss of lives that we see every day, whether it's at the hands of Israel or we see the violence from across the border that comes to the Kashmiris, whether we talk about issues like terrorism, where Pakistan has suffered consistently and continues to suffer. More than 2 decades have passed. When we stand resolutely against that terrorism, that is a constant battle for each and every Pakistani. The way that our women, our children, and our forces lose their lives fighting for terrorism, to keep Pakistan safe, to keep Pakistanis safe, to keep this region potentially safe. And of course, climate change, which is extremely important. And again, the way Pakistan has suffered about $30 billion just last year, the damage, the reparation that still awaits. Pakistan is still awaiting the reparation that is needed when the injustice of the world is that we are less than 1% emitters of fossil fuel, and yet we continue to suffer. Let's hope that the world understands. Let's hope that the world continues to at least see the way that the people suffer and the way the people around the world have raised their voice for these concerns. Thank you so much for joining us today.